Hi, this is Geoff Berry, and welcome to the Nature Calling channel, where we aim to deepen connection to the earth and to the spirit of life and to all our kin on this beautiful planet.
So thank you so much for joining me, Linda. I was extremely excited to get to talk to you ever since, the anthology on ecotherapy, which I felt like was it was the book that really brought it front and center. I'd been working in ecopsychology for some time, and I guess I felt like it was time for it to become a practice.
Yes.
I guess.
Yes, that was actually the impetus for doing the book.
Oh, great.
I've been involved in ecopsychology for a while, but I kept annoying the other people I knew by saying, but how do you do it? What does ecotherapy look like? So that's why Craig and I put that book together.
That's perfect. It's almost exactly the same question I asked. You answered it, said thank you and Craig, because every time I read a book that answers my question, I think, good, that's another one I don't have to not getting around to writing. But, and it's so jam-packed with all these voices that are bringing different aspects of what we could be doing together. So
we were really happy to get some of the people who we were able to get, like Joanna Macy, and we just had some really great people who had wonderful things to share.
Yes. And speaking of that, well, that's where I was first introduced to George Burns,
Yes.
who I later found was Australian and have since made a great connection with. But the other, you mentioned Joanna Macy, and I've had a good connection with John Seed over here as well. And he joked that he went back to Joanna at one stage and said, I can't figure it out, but everything I'm trying with groups of people in nature is working. He says, how come? And she said, yeah, that's because that's all you have to do is get groups of people in nature and listen carefully and share respectfully, and something good will come of it.
Absolutely.
Seems a beautiful grounding wisdom. And thanks for letting me send you a couple of question prompts. This wasn't one of them, so I don't want to put you on the spot. But that brings to mind, that stream you've been sharing lately about eco liberation, ecotherapy.
Right. That's a phrase that was coined by Phoenix Smith, who's a social worker and the founder of the Alliance for Ecotherapy and Social Justice.
Yeah. And she's really taking that, to a real level of saying, I watched the video you shared of hers, and, it was really like, just do it, I guess, was part of the message. Just get people together and, in a way, slightly confronting for me, a person who tried really hard to work in the system. I got my master's, I got my PhD, I became an academic, I started teaching, and it's like, on the one hand, I want to say we need respect for those traditions because they make you work hard and you do peer review and it's all checked, and, that's how we get good science and so forth. And on the other hand, of course, I want to jump in full boots with her and say, people just have to do this stuff, and we have to find a different way to build mutual respect. And, sure, listen to the elders and listen to the wisdom and read the books and so forth. But I really appreciated the freshness and that social justice aspect she brought to the game as well.
It's really critical, and it has been since the beginning of the field. But we've sort of ignored it. I mean, Carl Anthony was telling us this in 1995, warning ecopsychology that we had to deal with this sort of society part of the equation as well, environmental justice, all these other issues. And it wasn't just all feel-good stuff with the rest of nature. And of course, Andy Fisher's work, his book, Radical Ecopsychology, has been also emphasizing that it's not enough just to heal the relationship between psyche and the rest of nature. we also have to heal the relationship with society. So it really becomes this triangle of hopefully mutually healing polarities that can begin to come together. Plus, right now we have the clock ticking. This is much more urgent than it was when ecopsychology emerged, let's say in the 1960s and then the 90s. It's like we've really been not stepping up the way we need to. But at this point, I think there's very few of us who don't realize that we're in a super urgent situation. Now what? Now what do we do? How do we cope?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I got pretty involved in Extinction Rebellion in that early couple of years. And having been an environmental activist of some stripe for my whole adult life. But I do feel like for me, the long emergency, as it's also been known, that, you know, people have realized we're at the pointy end of it now. If anything, it probably has pushed me even deeper into radical eco-psychology, to use Andy's phrase, and ecotherapy. Just because I think there are a lot of people that are being inspired towards environmental activism now. I almost feel like I've kind of done that. There's a whole lot of new people doing that. But what seems just as important and what I'm not seeing enough people doing, but actually, you know what? It's not even that rational. My soul calling now is just to do the soul work and to say, what do we do when the mainstream, when the public really figures out how bad this is? Because so many of them are still caught up in the dream, the ongoing consumption techno fix dream.
Right. But I think this is where it's good to go back to Joanna Macy again. I don't know how she's been this far ahead of us for decades and decades, but she was. I mean, she talks about holding actions, a 3-part agenda she gives us. She said, definitely do your holding actions, but it's not enough. You also have to be involved in building the world that you want to live in. And for me, anyway, that's permaculture, which of course comes out of Australia.
Yeah.
And then the third one is raise your level of consciousness. So this is where the eco-spiritual part of it that you were talking about really comes into play. And that she talks about how you can't do just one of these things because you get stuck. Like if you're just doing the holding actions, you can get burnout.
Yeah.
If you're just building this wonderful permaculture food forest and you do nothing else, the world is still going to hell in a handbasket. And if you just raise your level of consciousness to some serene place where you're, let's say, meditating all the time, the same problem, that's wonderful. You're feeling much better, but the world is still going to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah. And you're actually ignoring a reality that you know about. Like that would be my problem.
Exactly. So this is the delicate balance, is how to do all 3 of these things simultaneously while the long emergency, or I should say the short emergency at this point, is happening, and somehow balancing it all, taking care of yourself, listening to your calling, doing what you feel you're being called to do to help all of us do this. And the other thing Joanna Macy had right was whatever you plan on doing during the long emergency, don't do it alone. Or I think she said the great turning, don't do it alone. So that's what you've been talking about, is this community eco-psychology. And Carol Koziol has begun to write about it as well, and some other people, realizing that we have to escape this kind of toxic individualism of Western psychology.
Yeah.
It's not going to solve the problem.
Yeah. And that probably does come back to that original prompt I wanted to ask you about. You know, as a person that's practiced and you would have done plenty of one-on-one, I'm sure.
Oh yeah.
Is, you know, and again, I'm feeling that tension immediately again between, like, you know, having well-informed people leading the work, because I came through all the new age stuff back in the 90s. You know, I've been in some pretty dodgy workshops and just thought, I don't know where you're coming from, but I want to stand for that stuff, but it's like, we really need to do the work. But it does seem to me we need to do the work in groups now. Like, yeah, there's that one-on-one therapy, which I still stand for. You know, I've come from a trauma-informed work background as well. And there are people that really need a safety barrier around them, especially traumatized children, which was my work. You know, I think that's still valid, but, you know, we had the mega fires near where I live, New Year's 2020. Now we've had the big floods this last year or so in northern New South Wales and Queensland. You know, I'm utterly convinced that this is not going away. This is something that's only going to keep coming at us. There's no doubt in my mind at all that we're in an exponential feedback loop. This is what we have to deal with now. And I think when I see big populations of people being affected, we don't have enough therapists to do this one-on-one anymore, even if that was still an option. And I do remember that phrase by Joanna Macy. In fact, it jumped out at me, and forgive me if I haven't got it exactly right, but I think she said, don't even think about doing it alone. Exactly. And I remember I was always a real lone wolf, you know. I thought, ooh, wow, is she talking to me there? And here I am, you know, 20, 30 years later, just it's echoing, and I'm seeing the wisdom, and I'm realizing this will cut back a little bit to something you've already said too. When I work in groups, you know, it goes beyond just me and nature, which is always what I wanted, and me and nature and the cosmos, the right. big picture of deep connection. And I fall in love with these people I'm working with, you know, in this really beautiful way. We all have these amazing connections, and everyone comes out renewed and refreshed and reinvigorated. And I think, well, I didn't care about you people. You were just part of the group at the start. But now I realize that people, you know, they're our tribe, they're our first kinship. I always wanted to reanimate my relationship with my kin in nature, with the other animals and the plants and the elements. I wanted that full animist reality, you know, and deeply embedded in my psyche. But actually other people have become special to me again, and that's kind of ironic. It's been through doing nature work in groups that I've kind of feel like I've healed my relationship with my society as well.
Which is wonderful, and it's certainly what we want. But I don't think it's either or, in the sense that I still see a place, especially as you mentioned, with very traumatized people, to do work individually or with small groups, small families. But then I do see the necessity of community work where there's larger groups that come together. And just as where you are, we here also have ongoing wildfires. We've just had a huge drought. You've probably seen the pictures on the news. And there's this ongoing need for community support, both during the trauma and also in terms of the fear that happens where people have eco-anxiety. Excuse me, you know, we're just moving into spring here and then we're going to summer. Well, we're all having PTSD because summer means we may have more of these horrible hot days. We may be in drought again, and we may have our wildfires back. And then we have the same thing in the fall and the winter was suddenly, we're remembering the last time we had a lethal mud flow here and 23 people in our community died. It's like, this is where I think ecotherapists have a lot of work to do. We've become first responders.
Oh, that's right.
In our communities, which I think a lot of us didn't realize when we got into being a therapist. Whoops, I think we've lost the screen here a little bit.
Okay.
But basically, that's what we've all had to realize, that our training is useful and our communities need us, whether we're hosting a climate cafe to help people in the community who are feeling so desperate and despairing about the climate or the environmental situation. Young people saying they're afraid to have children right now because of what's coming or what's happening. And all the other issues that people are dealing with that are related to ecology and the environment. So we've been called, whether we like it or not. I found myself leading grief groups on the beach during an oil spill here. It's like I never trained to do that. That was just something that happened. And I think we've become sort of emergency medicine people.
Yeah.
Even though that may not have been why we got into this field.
Sure. And I mean, you know, we are lucky though that the field has consciously drawn upon ideas of medicine that are way beyond, you know, modern Western ideas. So I've learned so much from Indigenous people, both, you know, working with them in person here in Australia and reading anthropology and just, you know, realizing that a good story is medicine.
That's right. Yeah, there's so much for those of us who were not brought up in Indigenous cultures to really unlearn and then relearn a whole new way of being that's earth-centered, which is certainly not what I was brought up with. I don't know about you.
Yeah, and I think it is a response. You know, when I came out of the master's and into the PhD in that phase, early 2000s, I remember realizing that it really was about story as medicine. My background was myth and symbol. And I was specifically seeking myths that tied us in relationship with the earth, because I was seeing that we were still living in a mythic society, but it was a myth that very specifically drew us away from that relationship. You know, it was like a sideshow hustle, you know, come over here, everybody, there's some shiny stuff for you. And I felt like the whole of modern society was getting hustled into this bright, shiny sideshow, and the real story, the real medicine that had always been there in every culture, including ours, was respect your brothers in the trees and the forest and the seas.
Exactly. And, you know, the school that I teach at is very Jungian in orientation. And so that's definitely part of what is important to us, is the idea of story and the arts and all of these different things that need to feed into our ecopsychology and ecotherapy.
Yeah, it's not just, I mean, I do a lot of the sort of the sit spot and the deep listening and the really being with nature, but the art, the stories, the muses, they come straight back in too.
Exactly. And that's part of, I think, how we stay sane as we're going through this traumatic period. You know, how do we keep our joy in life alive while we're doing this difficult work and when we're facing up to some really scary situations? And that's this delicate balance that I think Joanna Macy's talking about, is we're going to be working hard and yet enjoying life, certainly celebrating what remains, being grateful for every good thing, for every healthy bit of the rest of nature that is here now, even though we're afraid maybe it won't last for long. So I think it's a very skillful way of living. And I credit Joanna Macy's Buddhism for inspiring her in how to do this delicate dance, because I think the Buddhists do have a lot of wisdom about living through really, really difficult times and difficult situations that's useful right now.
Yeah. I'm a Zen practitioner myself, and I remember some of the stories about the early masters. They're just, you know, they had some brutal realities they were working with, especially some of the women. Our group did a bit of a project in uncovering the stories of the, you know, mostly lost stories of the women Zen masters through the lineages. And yeah, I mean, I won't go into them, but they definitely know how to face reality. And you know, you're talking about first responders, we're talking about fires and floods. I mean, it is something, and story, it is something we have to get better at, because I think what I see a lot of, big picture, subtle, it's not necessarily, you know, I guess something that's being drawn out in the mainstream story, but I think I'm seeing a lot of people being shocked that the story that they thought they were a part of is breaking down. And again, Joanna Macy's talked about this, and the Findhorn people talk about the, you know, the great turning, the new story, these kinds
and
of
the great unraveling.
And the great unraveling.
Another phrase I like, the great unraveling, and some people call it collapse.
Mm.
It's nice to have words for it.
Sometimes.
You know, as it's happening, where you sort of figure out what's happening, what's going on. It's nice to have those words. I find them comforting, even though it's a scary situation.
Yeah. And look, I mean, I use the word collapse. I'm trying to actually use it more in a way that moves beyond just, you know, we have to deal with this, and saying, I mean, I've dealt with this, in my opinion, where, you know, the sixth mass extinction event, I don't see how we get out of it. You know, it's like we are in so much trouble. I just think it's better to speak clearly about it, as you say, and to have a story ready. I don't necessarily have a nice, hopeful story ready, but I do have a story of reconnection in the circle. I think you've alluded to this, of what we have right now, what we can still be looking for.
Exactly.
And the life we've had. Like, I am so grateful just to have been incarnated as a self-aware primate on this planet.
Yeah. Exactly.
Even if we're watching a lot of breakdown. So let me ask you, what have you seen working? What do you think is a good way of being involved in ecotherapy and in applied ecopsychology when you're facing, let's say, a broad scale trauma and a fire or a flood?
Well, it's interesting you're talking about story, because I think that's one of the keys, isn't it? To get together in community. Could be just a small group of people, or it could be a larger group of people. And people, it's like with any trauma, people need to tell their story.
Yeah, sure.
And it's so helpful to hear everybody's story. Here's what happened at my house. Here's what went on at this other place. And it's all local. It helps to be local. So the whole idea of the climate cafe, or, you know, there's many other things. I used to belong for 10 years to a voluntary simplicity circle. And it was the same kind of idea where we would just share ways we were trying to live a more earth-friendly life. And it feeds you so much, you know, because you're hearing ideas from other people, and you may have some good ideas of your own, and everything gets shared in the circle. And I think there's such resilience in that simple form of the circle, sitting around the fire or just sitting around together.
How we evolved. And if you look at the myths, you know, I can't believe it. I was just telling a story yesterday. Prometheus straight away came back up. I mean, their stories are so resilient. They've adapted through all those thousands of years, and we adapted them. We kept reshaping them around the campfire, right? So what you're talking about really is bringing some energy back to that kind of way of being.
Exactly. And somehow we'd forgotten. And of course, it doesn't help that we're, you know, talking through screens all the time, although you can have a wonderful circle online, as you know.
Sure.
I'm teaching online right now, which is an amazing experience. So I think we maybe even have, in addition to the old ways, which are, of course, the best, of being there in person with each other, we also have other ways, since we're kind of time pressured here, of sharing a lot of good information, good support systems widely around the planet in real time. So I'm all for that, at the same time that I would prefer to sit outside in nature with a small group of people.
Yeah. And really, though, as you say, like we moved away from it a fair bit. I guess that's kind of what my research was figuring out how the myth got changed so much, like what happened, how did we get to this place? But, you know, something you've said there that's jumped out at me that I've just quickly jotted down is that we haven't actually valued story enough. We haven't realized, I guess, in a way, it's almost like, you know, how Weber talked about the iron cage of rationality, or it's almost like we convinced ourselves we were in this, you know, well-reasoned, scientifically informed and post-enlightenment consciousness that had it all figured out. without realizing that, of course, is a story. So we're in this new story and thinking, yeah, this is the one. We figured it out. We can drive around and, and create a global marketplace and extract whatever we want from the planet. And that was a story, but we're so wrapped up in it.
Well, that's a collapsing story, isn't it?
It is now.
I mean, I used to work for years in Hollywood as a story editor.
I did not know that.
I did. So I'm with you on this whole issue of story. And I think a lot of people have been writing about the need for a new story, that sort of post-colonial, decolonized, post-industrial almost story of what life could be like. And I think it's the area where we're weakest. We don't really yet have a full vision. What's the story of what would it look like if we were really living in this deep earth connected way?
Yeah.
And certainly there's a lot of inspiration from indigenous cultures around the world. We have a lot to unlearn and a lot to relearn, those of us who are living in industrialized places. And it can seem overwhelming, like, oh my gosh, how can we change fast enough to get back to that earth way? But the first step is, as you say, the story and the vision. If we can imagine it, we at least have a possibility that we could create it.
Yeah, and the gardening and the sharing.
Exactly.
You actually have to get your hands a bit dirty, I found, and
oh yeah,
it's been good. But you brought me around to that place that so I read your recent piece on the Procrustean bed, and I thought this was quite inspiring to me, because I really, I do have to do that dance. I'm still an academic of sorts. I'm teaching in a higher ed institution, as well as trying to keep my ecopsychology as radical and true to the animist vision as possible. And I was really pleased that yourself and Craig Chalquist just published on that. It's a beautiful brief. It's really economical little piece. But if I may, to paraphrase it, it basically says, don't give in. Don't let the mainstream kind of psychology, academic institution, clinical framework turn ecopsychology, I might use one of your phrases, back into a level 1 process where we're just using nature, make ourselves feel better, and back on the treadmill. It was almost a call to arms, I thought.
That's how I feel about it. We have to recognize that Western psychology is part and parcel of the old story of basically, industrial culture. That's how it's evolved. Doesn't mean there's not a lot of good things in it.
Yeah, sure.
But we have to be really careful. And what's happening a little bit right now within ecopsychology and ecotherapy is there's this rush in of people who've been Western psychology trained, who are kind of interpreting it in their own framework.
Okay.
They're not seeing that it's actually a lot bigger and it's more radical. It's demanding more of us than just one more tool in the Western therapist toolkit.
Interesting. So
go ahead.
Well, what I'm hearing, and I should have realized this, it's partly because your North American experience, you have such a higher level of population and economy than us. You're so much further down the track. You've got to see down under. I'm still struggling to get ecopsychology and ecotherapy heard by the mainstream. And all of a sudden, I think what's happening is something you are indicating. People are really listening. Like all of a sudden, people want to know about this because times are changing so fast and people are realizing we're so disconnected from nature. I think that's generally pretty well appreciated now. But where you're working, it's almost like it's gone beyond that, and they're just, the mainstream almost just wants to swallow it up and say, right, well, we'll sanitize that. We'll turn it into our industrial program, make some money out of it. Thank you very much. Sure, you first guard.
Exactly. That's it. Yeah, and the danger is that we could get swallowed up by that.
Yeah,
it's meant well. I mean, Western medicine is suddenly, the nature prescription is now in mainstream medicine here. And everybody wants to go green, but we have to be a little bit cautious because a lot of people don't really understand the radical nature of this, that it's not going to be enough to just green up whatever we're already doing, that we're actually talking about something kind of revolutionary, which is a whole different way of living, both for our society and for us personally.
It's actually changing the system.
Exactly. And that, of course, is a radical proposition. The minute you talk about changing the dominant systems on the planet, yeah, that's radical.
That's great. Well, I've got to say, like I've mentioned to you in the email, it's just really refreshing, you know, and I think it's important that we speak about this, because there'll be people that'll be right on that line. That'll be like, well, it would be easy for me just to take a bit of ecopsychology and ecotherapy. I can green up my practice and I can, you know, take advantage of that. But then, you know, that what you're standing up for is saying, yes, but if we don't, in fact, embed ourselves back into the natural matrix, into the ecosystem, if we don't become responsible ecological citizens, then we're just working in that colonial post-industrial mindset all over again. And how does that fix anything?
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, it's a special problem in the US, of course, because we have this amazing ability to absorb and incorporate everything and boil it down until it fits in our system. We've done it with yoga. We've done it with meditation. It's just the newest fad.
Right.
So that's why I put out that cautionary thing with Craig, where we just say, wait, just hang on a minute here, that we just don't want to lose the best of what's involved in these fields just to sort of fit into, as you put it, the new wellness fad, which is tricky, right? It's not always easy. But another way of looking at this is to view it as sort of a gateway drug, is another way of putting it, that this people get into it perhaps not for these ultimate reasons that we're talking about, but they just think it's one more thing that might make them feel better, which is fine, because I'm hoping that once they get involved in the field, they'll go down the rabbit hole with us. They'll see how much deeper this thing really is. And of course, in ecotherapy, nature is the ultimate therapist.
Yeah.
And I have total confidence that if people are out in and around and experiencing themselves as part of nature, that's truly revolutionary and radical. So let's just get everybody out there and see what happens.
It's and that is the thing that stays with people, right? It's why so many people talk about, when I'm in a new group, okay, why are you here? I like to be, you know, a little bit confrontational at the start. Why did you choose to be here? And so many times people just had a really special relationship with nature as a child that they'd lost, and they just said, because I want it back. Exactly.
And I'm also trying to train therapists to ask different questions in their therapy, to do what's called the Earth story or the ecobiography, to find out when, you know, what a person's relationship with the rest of nature was when they were a child. And often that releases a flood of feelings and memories. And it's not a question we ask in mainstream psychotherapy, because we have that sort of fictitious Adam's wall where we somehow think that we're entirely separate from and superior to the rest of nature.
Yeah.
So even just asking questions like that, if you're a therapist, it just opens up the whole therapy, even if you're still sitting like I used to be in a windowless room in Los Angeles with your client under fluorescent light. It's like you can even do ecotherapy there.
Oh yeah, like, you know, I've definitely seen some great work around bringing nature in.
Yes.
We don't have to go out to it, as long as we bring it into the story.
Yeah.
You know, our buildings are really just highly technical hives. You know, we're good at it, but lots of animals can do that.
I know. Well, we used to use a nature tray in our offices, where we would have a tray in the room and people would bring things from their hikes or from nature. I would bring things from our food forest, and I would ask people as a homework, really, to take a walk, let's say, in some aspect of the rest of nature, and maybe find an object that called to them. Maybe it was a leaf, just something small, but it touched them or it called to them, and then bring that into the room, and that would somehow, synchronistically connect with whatever had brought them into therapy in the first place. So there's lots of ways to do the ecotherapy.
Yeah, and again, the connection between nature and stories, that then can become a touchstone, right? Because another part of our problem is we're actually trained to be consumers. Like, we are socialized to just keep consuming. But if the story we kept getting, instead if it was a TV screen with ads saying just keep buying stuff, everything will work out in the long run, even though we actually know that doesn't make us happy in the long run at all. But if the story was, remember that shell you picked up and how you felt really connected through that? That's your touchstone. You keep coming back to that just like once a month or so, then that's the thing you keep remembering. That's the story you want to be a part of. I want to feel connected. I want to feel like nature is calling me, that it's singing to me, and that I'm at home here. Something I think we've really missed out on. So many people just don't feel at home in their bodies or their places.
That's right. And of course, that brings up the whole necessity for the decolonizing work for those of us who are settlers on stolen land and other people's land. And that's a whole big process of helping, kind of pull down those walls.
I've been working on how that is to be integrated. So the main thing I'm doing is providing, actually similar to what you said now, providing training to therapists to add ecotherapy into their practice, but definitely doing it at a post-colonial level too. I'm really into that animism, kinship, deep listening aspect. So that's the first thing I give people. When I run it as an intensive, I say, okay, the first thing you do is just go out, shut up, and sit under a tree, because you got to refill on this stuff if you're going to help other people to get to that place.
It's true. And also people are adding to that. A lot of ecotherapists were doing this connect with the land work, but they weren't, at least around here, they weren't acknowledging whose land it was and what history of that relationship was. And that's been a real eye-opener for many ecotherapists, the need to do the land acknowledgement, the need to reconnect with the rightful owners of the land and get re-educated. And that's added a whole dimension to ecotherapy that wasn't there even 10 years ago.
It's true. And it's really, but it's increased very quickly, right? Like it's a total thing now. Like everyone in Australia starts public meetings with an acknowledgement of country. Whenever we can, we'll invite a traditional owner or traditional person or spokesperson or elder to come along and actually to do a welcome. And it really breaking people down. I think on the one hand, people are really becoming more open to that. But I think on the other hand, there's also a sense in which it's really opened up a lot of unconscious grief.
Oh, yes. Yes.
For us, for people who've benefited from colonization, like myself, I talk to them about ancestors and say, look, your ancestors evolved in the forest. If you have European genetic heritage, your people evolved in the forest, like close contact to nature. 99% of our evolution, as we know, urban civilization is very recent. But you've also got to think. So I do talk about our ancestral lineages, back to Europe and back to Asia for people from there, wherever we came from.
Right.
But yeah, I think as a post-colonial project, we also have to talk about blood being shed and the ancestors of the land, the people who cared for the country for millennia. And I'm surprised by people's courage and ability to go into that space. I think people have really woken up to it. I think, again, it got whitewashed. It was just a story no one wanted to talk about. In here, our countries are very similar in that sense. We're just slightly recent.
I think it's real. I agree with you that it's happening quickly, and I'm very grateful for that. Another very practical topic for ecotherapists has been the need to basically not just earn money from doing this work, but also to pay rent, which has been a kind of a radical concept for some. But it's like, if you're making money helping people connect with land, then part of that money has to go back to the original peoples of that land.
That's a thing.
So, yeah, it's a thing. And I was advised by a local Chumash person who I respect very much of where that money should go. So I took her advice.
Yeah.
And there's a certain foundation that had been set up that I didn't know about.
Yeah.
And I just think we're all learning, and it's a huge learning process. Yeah. And it's not always comfortable. There's a lot of grief to it on both sides. But I think there's just so much that can happen and is happening. Everything's speeded up, hasn't it? It's not just technology that's speeded up. It's culture, it's systems. Everything is speeding up.
That's right.
True for ecotherapy and ecopsychology as well.
I have that phrase, everything is exponential. That's how I put it. Yeah. Everything. Carbon parts per million, exponential. The parts, what we're trying to do about it, exponential. Also, your capacity to link into this kind of work, to come back to yourself and to have a kind of, a spiritual relationship with your ecosystem. And that's a whole new conversation, because I don't like to be too loose with that kind of language around eco-spirituality, but that's exponential too. This story is breaking out everywhere you look, and people are working with it, which means you have opportunities that literally did not exist. As you said, 10 years ago, we would not have been having the same conversation.
It's true. And it's why one of the questions that I encourage people to ask, especially therapists, is when is the time in your life when you felt closest to something sacred? Nice. Because at least in my practice, 9 times out of 10, that person will tell me about some experience with some aspect of the rest of nature. Maybe it's a dog they grew up with. Maybe it was a camping experience. Maybe it was, but it just seems like there's just something about that connection with the rest of nature that's inherently spiritual. There's no avoiding that. And in fact, I think it's good to welcome it into the conversation, because it's so healing and it's so inspiring for whatever work we're called to do.
Yeah, it's a way of like emptying our personal history into that much bigger, that oceanic experience, that the bigger ecosystem, and recognizing ourselves as a tiny part of a great flow of life.
That's right.
Yeah. In a good way. We can empty ourselves out in ways that are really unhelpful, but that's the way to do it, let's say. But look, the other thing you said in there that I just wanted to hark back to, I think it was really beautiful, was simple but beautiful, was, you asked your Chumash, I think that was right, connection. Yes. Like, where do I put this money? We have to ask and listen as well.
Exactly. The guidance is there, and often people are willing to give it. Not necessarily for free, and nor should it be.
Indeed.
There has to be the reciprocity.
Yeah.
But yes, there is so much that's available to us if we just ask with cultural humility and are open to the answer. If that is what needs to be done, absolutely, I'm willing to do that.
Yeah, it's been my experience also. I think ultimately the people who have that direct link to culture, like the Australian Aboriginals where I live, they'd like to see people coming back to being connected to nature. I don't think it's, they want that to happen. They just need some of us to have the courage, and the humility was the word you used, to actually ask how this can be done, and show some thanks in response.
Exactly. And I think it's appreciated, the acknowledgement that many have had it right all along, and we've been the ones who got way off track, which is we're responsible for the disaster we've created. That's hard to live with. It's hard to really open yourself up to that, which is why the nature part of it is so important, to balance that out. You don't want to just get mired in the grief or even feelings of shame or guilt permanently. What you want to do is just to acknowledge what has happened and figure out how can I be part of healing that.
Yeah. And my experience has been when I'm faithful to those feelings, when I actually allow them to happen and sit with them, they wash through. It's like we're scared of something that's, that the fear is worse than the reality. The grief feels terrible, but but once it's passed through, you just have reality. You have more space to have a relationship with what's really there, your ecosystem and your way of life and your beliefs.
Exactly.
Oh, that's a lovely.
I thought of one more thing that came to mind about back to sort of having nature incorporated in our therapy is I know that with veterans, military veterans who have PTSD and other trauma people, that sometimes having a nature object that somehow symbolizes for that person what they're carrying that they haven't been able to let go of. In many cases, a small stone or something like that. And the whole process, a lot of this veterans therapy is being done in groups. Of course, it's much more effective. But where people have that little item, whatever it is, that token.
Yeah.
And then they get to process it and then to decide when they're ready to put it down and let it go. Whether it's burying it in the earth or whether it's taking it out to the ocean, which is so huge and can absorb all that pain, all that trauma. That I think that's one of the techniques of ecotherapy that I find most inspiring.
Nice. And it's really keeping it real too, right? It is. You can come to a weekend workshop and let all your trauma go. It's like, well, you got something you're going to have to hold on to. At least have that talisman, have that connection.
Right. And you may not be ready to let it go. I mean, real deep trauma like that, I don't think is something people let go in one session or even in multiple sessions. Even if it's in a group and you're surrounded by other people who've had exactly that traumatic experience, it's going to take however long it takes. And you can have that little stone with you the whole time until you're ready. We're not going to rush you.
Yeah.
You decide when you think you might be ready to put that back in its natural place.
You've brought up an ironic relationship to time, which I've been noticing has been coming up a fair bit in this work, which is, all right, it's an emergency. Slow down.
Right.
We've really got to do something. Slow down. Because it's actually, again, it's that unlearning, right? Just take out that idea that we're going to fix this and drop in a little bit, because we actually need time to re-engage. That's what we need. Again, valuing a better story. Why don't we commit time to just really being here and trying to re-engage with our ecosystem, with other people, with learning from elders and so forth. And time has it's a malleable quality. It has different ways of being. And I feel like, again, we say everything's exponential. Modern society, the speed, the screen time, the technology, the revolution of like a new app every second, absolutely nuts. It's so nice to get off that train, I find.
It is. And I think that's a core theory and practice within ecotherapy is slowing down to nature's pace. Because there's no way that nature left alone operates at the speed that it's an artificial mechanical speed.
Yeah.
In industrial culture, where we've speeded up to machine pace.
Yeah.
And now it's internet pace. It's just our bodies are still part of nature, obviously. And yet we're trying to operate like machines. I mean, no wonder we have such an epidemic of mental health problems.
Yeah, just the anxiety provoking nature of, like you said, it's a primate body. that we have, but our minds are working at the speed of light. And again, I mean, that's actually a fairly timeless problem. The mind-body relationship. It's always been something we had to figure out. The Buddha was onto that. I've spoken to elders about this kind of stuff. That's not new. It's just that the technology that we're working with has gone at that speed of light. It's totally not a human time frame anymore. And having the time, as you said, like trauma takes a long time to let go of. That's been my experience.
Yep.
It can get hardwired, and hardwires are much harder to dissolve.
Mm-hmm.
Bit of time.
Yeah, I think time is a huge issue to really think through. And, people don't understand why this, however, 500,000, many more centuries old body is not feeling good at this mechanical industrial pace.
Yeah.
People are sometimes mystified that they can't keep up. Like, well, why can't I?
Yes. That's
but who's demanding that you do? I mean, who is it? This is where we have to look at capitalism too. That, the factory mentality, just slotting human bodies into minds and souls into these industrial processes that works for the machine, but it doesn't work for people. It certainly doesn't work for these practices that take a lot of time, like family life or raising children or, having a pregnant body. It's like, it doesn't fit into that mechanical industrial time frame that we're trying to fit everybody into.
Yeah, it's definitely not made to fit anymore. Modern society and technology. And again, I want to come back to that radical point that you're making and helping to keep concrete, which is that it's no longer our job to say, why can't I keep up? Why can't I be happy as a modern consumer? It's our right to say, I don't fit. If I feel like I don't fit in that system, I've got to listen to that voice, the one that says, this isn't working anymore.
Exactly. And I think more and more people are feeling that. Industrialists are aware that there are labor problems now, as more and more people are saying, I don't want that job. That job makes me feel awful. Surely there's some other way I could figure out how to live other than this.
Yeah.
So that labor relations are in a revolution.
Everything's connected.
Yeah.
I want to underscore that we have the right to ask how we would like to live with this one wild life.
Exactly.
And we can do that together and in connection, really re-engage with nature, with story, with time, with what actually works on our scale.
Exactly. What makes life worth living? Yeah.
Thank you, Linda Buzzell.
Well, you're very welcome.
I'm so pleased you made this time for us. And, and I know I can speak for anyone who'll get to watch this. It's been a real pleasure to hear you. And I'm reminded a little of Joanna Macy. I was in a grief ritual with her recently, and you know what I was amazed by? She's basically saying exactly the same thing she's been saying the whole time.
Exactly.
She's like, she must have had it. And
40, 50 years she's been doing that. She was way ahead of the rest of us.
And what was great was she refused to because of course, gazillions of people wanted to be a part of it. Now it's a big popular thing. She refused to let the timescale take away from her commitment to share deep listening. So she just said, I don't care if we don't get through all the steps of the grief ritual that I had planned. What do you have to say? How does this make you feel? She just stayed with that core truth.
Wow. It's so really wise.
So we keep on trying, and you've given us lots of hints. So thank you. I feel like we can, people can be more emboldened to value their own story and how that connects them to that deeper picture of the Earth matrix and where we really fit in it. So let's support that.
Yes.
Thank you, Linda.
Well, thank you too. It's been good to talk with you.
Great.
Thanks for watching, and please consider liking this video. And if you want more content like this, subscribe, and the Nature Calling bell will toll for you. This is Geoff signing off.